G'day, I'm Chris Muir. In this ADF Insider Essentials presentation, we're going to be looking at an ADF Mobile feature called URL Schemes. The URL Scheme feature allows iOS and Android applications to open or call each other and pass values between each application. So in this ADF Insider Essentials recording, I'd like to start out with a world record, something that's never been done before. But before I can do that, I need to introduce you to a little bit of history. For the audience, you would be quite familiar, or hopefully familiar, with the classical comedy duo from America of Abbott and Costello. William Bud Abbott and Louis Costello were a comedy duo that came out of post-World War II. They did the vaudeville scene, did a lot of plays, stage acts, radio shows, TV shows, and even movies over that period. And they had quite a famous comedy act called Who's On First? Who's On First? Also known as the baseball scene. Now, Abbott and Costello, they had numerous different versions of this routine available, and I'd love to include one of those routines and broadcast it here on this ADF Insider Essentials. As far as I know, those recordings are now free for public distribution, but let's not get the Oracle lawyers worried about actually showing that video. What I'd like you to do is, hey, take 5 minutes out of your day to go and watch Who's On First on YouTube. Essentially just Google Who's On First Abbott and Costello, and you'll find plenty of hits there and many different versions of that famous skit from Abbott and Costello. So I hope you've taken a little bit of time out of your day to go and watch that famous Abbott and Costello routine. And, you know, for the first time ever, it's been totally justified at work that you can go and spend time on YouTube watching comedy acts because Oracle Corporation has suggested that you should do it. Now, Abbott and Costello had many different versions of the Who's On First routine and also put it onto lots of different platforms. So they did it in the vaudeville stage scene, then the stage scene in New York, then they took it to radio, TV, and even movies. There's lots of different versions of it. But where Abbott and Costello never actually got their act is onto mobile. And, you know, it's probably got something to do with that they're dead. But, you know, anyway, let's just put that aside. And what you're going to get on the ADF Insider Essentials episode today is a world first, the Abbott and Costello routine on mobile. You ready? Okay, so what I have in JDeveloper is two applications, the Abbott application and the Costello application, which I've already deployed to my iOS simulator. So over here is my iOS simulator, and you can see the two separate applications, and we're going to get these two applications to talk to each other in the famous Who's On First comedy routine. So first of all, I'm going to invoke the Abbott application. You can see it pops up and it says, Abbott says, his first line of the Who's On First routine. Strange as it may seem, they give ball players nowadays very peculiar names. Now that's actually a hyperlink, and we're going to use that to invoke the Costello application, pass that line across so Costello knows how to return. And when we click on that, Costello says, funny names. Click on that. Abbott says, nicknames, nicknames. Now on the St. Louis team we have Who's On First, what's on second, I don't know, is on third. Costello responds, that's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellows on the St. Louis team. I'm telling you, who's on first? What's on second? I don't know who's on third. So I'm sure you'll agree that the famous Abbott and Costello comedy routine, Who's On First, is totally nailed on mobile platform. I can't believe iTunes and the Google Play Store aren't full of Abbott and Costello applications. Putting the Abbott and Costello famous comedy routine aside, I hope this gives you an inkling of what's very cool about what we're attempting to do here. Basically, we have two disparate applications on our mobile or tablet devices, and they're calling each other. Now, normally they wouldn't be calling each other backwards and forwards, but maybe you'd have a situation where your application, say, invokes, hey, the LinkedIn application, and wants to look at somebody's profile. So one application calling another. And in addition, like we just said, when we're calling another application, we normally not only call it, but we have to pass in some values. So passing variables or state between the applications. And hey, these features are readily available to iOS and Android, and ADF Mobile has this built in. So what we're going to look at in this ADF Insider Essentials presentation is we're going to first of all revisit the concepts of URL and URIs. Then we'll look at URL schemes, and once we have that understanding, we'll then look at how one application can call another application. Then, because there are some nuances or differences between the iOS and Android platforms, we'll have a little chat about that. But then finally, we'll finish off this presentation or recording today with looking at how you configure an ADF mobile application so that it can be called by another application, and how that ADF mobile application can access the parameters or the values or the state that was passed from that other application and react to it. Okay, let's cover off some of the basic terminology we need to know. Now, you're probably already familiar with the concept of a URL or an URL, depending on how you want to pronounce it, or a Uniform Resource Locator. It's what you type into the browser in the address bar to visit a web address. And so therefore a URL defines a web address, some sort of resource that's a web addressable location, and it's typically made up of a schema name, a hierarchical part, and a set of parameters after the question mark. So as you can see in the example here, we have http://acme.com. HTTP is the schema name and the hierarchical part is acme.com. If we extend that example, now after the question mark, you can see a number of key value pairs here for the parameters that are passed to the web resource. Now, if you actually know what a URL is, you'll probably also know that in more recent times we've expanded or broadened its definition. We now have a concept of a Uniform Resource Identifier, or a URI. And what the URI does, as opposed to URLs, it says, well, it broadens its definition to include any resource out there and not just necessarily web resources. So a URL is now a type of or a subset of a URI. So what actually happens when we invoke a URL or a URI, such as the one on the screen here, http www.acme.com, question mark, and then a number of parameters. So we know what the browser does. It makes a HTTP call to a specific web address, www.acme.com, with the defined parameters which it passes over the actual network. Now, the HTTP part, we traditionally associate that with the schema name or URI scheme, and we say that that is the protocol to be used. As it can be seen here, we're using the HTTP protocol to call that web address, www.acme.com. Now, strictly speaking, that is known as the URI scheme, though loosely speaking it is often referred to as the URL scheme, and you'll see that that's what the terminology we'll use throughout the rest of this presentation. So on invoking a URI, yes, we go and visit that web address using the HTTP protocol, but there's something else that occurs. If you were to type that URL address into the Windows find box or into some other resource in your operating system, what would also happen is that the browser is invoked. The browser, being your favorite one, Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Internet Explorer, has actually been associated with that URL scheme, such that when it sees HTTP in the overall URI address, it knows that it needs to invoke a browser on your behalf. Now, it's worth noting with the URL schemes that they've actually moved beyond the protocol. So the previous one we saw that HTTP indicated that we're going to make a HTTP call to some sort of web address. That the URL scheme notation, well, these days it's used for all sorts of things. Just to prove it, if you look at this one on the screen here, you can see the file URL scheme. Well, it has no associated specific protocol. That will work on multiple different operating systems with multiple different file systems. It's not reliant on Samba or something else. So it just goes to show that these days the URL scheme is quite a flexible approach. And along with that, you're probably already familiar that if you're on a desktop or a mobile device and there is a URL in the application that you're using that uses a URL scheme which is preceded with tel for telephone or mail to for email, if you were to click on one of those links in your desktop application or touch them in your mobile device, it would, well, on a mobile device, the tel would obviously invoke the telephone and dial the number you can see on the screen there. Whereas on a desktop or mobile, clicking on the mail tool will actually invoke the local mail application. And this is where you start to get an idea of the power of URL schemes in invoking other applications. So this then goes on to the obvious question is, hey, what other URL schemes are available to me? We've got standard ones like HTTP, tel, and mail to. Surely lots of other applications out there have registered URL schemes. Well, this is true, they do. And for instance, if you're on an iPhone device, and here I had the iPhone simulator working, you'll notice if I type in maps:// into the browser, by doing that, that URL scheme will invoke Apple Maps. But if you were to go and attempt the same thing on an Android device, you'd discover that it doesn't work. And that's because, well, URL schemes are also, well, platform specific. So certainly applications have the ability to register themselves on the different platforms with a particular URL scheme, but what we'll discover is that different platforms and different vendors have done different things. Now this will make it a little tricky because what you need to do in your applications is have big fat if statements that says if I'm running on, say, iOS, then use this URL scheme, but if I'm running on Android, use this URL scheme. And it can be a little bit more complex than that because older versions of the operating systems didn't support older URL schemes at all, so you've got to actually put in guarding statements against that as well. And we're using this simple example of maps here, which is installed on most devices. But if you use a URL scheme of another application and that application isn't actually installed on the device, then the URL scheme mechanism won't work as well. So as you can see, there are some limitations, but it's the advantages that we're particularly interested in here. Okay, so up to now we've been talking about using URL schemes when invoking another application. Can we do the opposite? Can we get an application to invoke us via URL scheme? Well, yes we can. Now natively on iOS this feature is called URL schemes, but on Android this feature is called intent or intent filters. And basically both platforms allow applications to register their URL scheme or their intent, and then other applications can call them just like we saw previously where we were calling applications based on their URL scheme. Now with that in mind though, the little tip here is that even though they're called URL schemes on iOS and intent filters or intents on Android, when you're Googling, maybe use both terminologies, pieces of terminology, to actually find hits. And why am I giving you this little hint? Well, while there are native programmers on both platforms who may know the right terminology, what I've found from experience is that there are also a lot of hybrid programmers like us, the ADF Mobile programmers, out there who are saying, what's the equivalent Android feature to iOS URL schemes for application X? And often you do find results using that sort of Google query. So the terminology here is all a little bit mixed up now because we've got this concept of cross-platform development. It should give you a little bit of idea how to find information. So what's the process for registering your own custom mobile URL scheme? Well, first of all, the application needs to register its URL scheme. So in this example here, you can see I've got My Great App. Now, it's important that that URL scheme on the platform, the mobile device, is actually unique. So you need to think about those URL schemes and not think up a name which might accidentally collide with another application out there. There's also a certain argument that you shouldn't use the URL scheme, you should use the hierarchical part of the URL to specify the custom URL scheme to invoke your application. Now that's a little bit beyond what we'll be discussing with ADF Mobile today, but just to say, when you start creating your own schemes, you might be using a mechanism that's provided by ADF Mobile, but under the covers that's using an iOS or Android solution, and you need to go and do a bit of research to see what the different camps think you should do when creating your own URL scheme. Anyway, once you've defined your own URL scheme, any application on the device, including web pages that are just rendering on the device, that invoke that URL scheme will now automatically open your registered app. Now, of course, your app has to be installed for it to be actually invoked. Okay, it doesn't automatically get installed. It has to be installed already from the iTunes or the Google Play Store. Now, assuming the app is installed, okay, but it isn't running, it will have to start. Alternatively, if the app is in the background or it's currently suspended, it will be brought to the foreground. Okay, so such that the user can start interacting with the application after it's had a chance to respond to actually being called by the URL scheme. Now, when your application is invoked by the URL scheme or the URL path will also potentially have parameters attached with it. A bunch of key value pairs, param1, param2, param3, 1, 2, 3, 4, a bunch of text, a string, true and false values, and so on and so forth. Now, when you register your application, well, the URL scheme is about the only thing that's handled. In terms of the parameters, them being valid, them being processed and actually forcing your application to do anything, that's all up to you, okay? So programmatically, you're going to have to pull that string apart and actually do something with the parameters and force your application to do something. Talking about forcing the application to do something, it's not unusual to have one of the parameters which is actually invoking an action within your application. So where we used the LinkedIn example earlier on, maybe you would have view profile as an action. Or if you had a HR application, maybe you'd have something like create employee as an action written into one of the parameters. Okay, so you need to have a little bit of a think about the URL schemes that you can use and the actual complete URL that you're passing through, including the parameters, and thinking about how you're going to make use of them to drive your application. Okay, so we've got the basic idea now. We know the URL scheme, we've got to register it, and then we've got to process the parameters coming in via the URL. So all this in mind, let's now look at how to set this up for an ADF mobile application. Discussions have been rather generic to this point, but let's show you how to define your own URL scheme in your application, process those parameters, and make your application react to the event, or I guess the URL call to your application. So the first thing to realize in terms of ADF Mobile is URL schemes are only supported in the 11.1240 build 6451 release of ADF Mobile. Okay, so it's not in all versions. You need to be in a version that's higher than this. Then there's basically two parts to the setup. The basic setup is you define the application's URL scheme, and then you define a URL event listener in the lifecycle listener impl start method to listen for the URL scheme of your application being called. Then your application will naturally be invoked, and in that start method you then need to capture the payload if there is any and then react to it. That moves on to the slightly more tricky configuration is once you have that payload, you then need to pass it to the view controller layer where you have your ADF mobile features and get it to react to those parameters to do something in your application. Navigate to a feature, or as it says in the last step here, if that is a page or a feature that's already opened, you need to get it to refresh the UI such that if the application's already started, you will see the new data coming in. Now, 5 steps, very simple. Let's actually show you a demonstration how to do this in JDeveloper. So let's set up an existing application, okay, a Oracle HR application that shows departments and employees to register a URL scheme and allow an external application to come into the application and automatically view an employee. Now, before actually setting that up, well, let's have a look at the existing application. And if we put the Abbott and Costello applications aside, what we have is a brand new application called Oracle HR. When we select that application, it goes to a springboard which allows us to view 2 features, departments and employees. And currently, when we click on employees, it gives us a list of employees where we can pick out Louis Costello and then finally view his details. Now that application behind the scenes is very simple. We have a look at the ADF mobile application, Oracle HR app. You can see in the application file we have the Oracle HR app made up of 2 features, department feature and employees feature. Now before we have a look at those, what we need to have a look at is the data model for this application. And what it is there's an employees list object, which I already have open here, which basically creates a whole bunch of hard-coded employees. Now typically you're probably going to get those from a web service, but for demonstration purposes we're just going to use this Pojo. And the employees list basically creates a number of employees, which again is another POJO made up of a number of attributes such as employee ID, first, last, email, phone, and so on and so forth. Now we've published that as a data control so we can easily expose the employees list to the screens within our employees feature. And a little note here is in doing this, it's important that within the employees data control we come to the employees object, and within the attributes we've set the ID to the key attribute because this will be useful for actually selecting and viewing specific employees from the list. Now returning to the features, we have the departments feature, which currently does nothing. It's just dummy. I just needed 2 for the springboard to make it look like I actually had a number of different things in the application. But we've also got the employees feature, which calls the employees task flow. Now the employees task flow includes 2 pages. The view employees, which shows us the list of employees, and it's not very complicated. Basically it's a list view based off the employees data control. And for each list item, it shows the first and last name of the employees. What is important is that when the user selects one of those employees, a set property listener is used to grab the employee ID and throw it into application scope. Now that wraps around to the detail screen that we're just about to look at because it needs an employee ID to know which one to show. So that's why we're pushing this up to the application scope. So returning to the employees task flow, you've got the employees details screen. And the employee's details screen basically just outputs all the details on the employee, ID, first, last, phone number, and so on and so forth. But in its bindings file, importantly, what we have is, well, when the page is first executed, not only does it extract the iterators and the relating data, but it calls this action setEmpID, okay, and setEmpID calls the setCurrentRow with key value that we've set up here. And if we just have a quick look at that in code, what we'll notice is the setCurrent row with key value. All that does is it grabs the application scope empID that we selected on the previous screen and it pushes that into the employee list in order to select the current employee. Okay, so that's the basic application. Now we want to augment that with the URL schemes. So the first thing we probably want to do is we want to create a launcher app that will actually launch this application. And I've already done that previously. I've created a launcher app, and that launcher app is very, very simple, okay? It basically includes a single page, and in that single page it includes a Go link that's going to call our application with this URL scheme, my HR app. Then it's going to include this hierarchical part and a parameter. It's going to include the hierarchical part, show employee, and then as a parameter, employee ID 3. So ultimately that could be in any other mobile application. That doesn't necessarily need to be an ADF mobile application. You could even type that URL scheme in the browser and it's our Oracle HR application that's going to need to respond to this. Okay, so let's set up our Oracle HR app to use a URL scheme. Now, the first thing you need to do is go to your application XML file, which is accessible via the application resources, descriptors, ADF meta inf, and there's the application file there. Now, within the application page of the application file, you'll need to register a URL scheme, and I've already done one called my HR app. In fact, you remember from the launcher app, that was the one that I specified to call this application. Now next you need to configure a lifecycle listener impl, and I've done that, and I've already added some code behind the scenes where you can see the lifecycle listener impl and the start method. Now I've added a section of code to the start method and I'm going to explain what that does in a moment. Okay, we'll look at actually running the application in the debugger to step over this one source code line at a time to show you what it does, and you can actually see what values we're extracting as well. But one important part in this overall piece of code is at the very end it calls the employees feature, and that's the feature that we want to invoke from the URL scheme. And in doing that, you'll notice this last parameter here, URL launch. Now that's critical. That is the navigation rule that will be called when that feature is opened. And remember that feature is a task flow. So if we go to the employees task flow, what I've done is I've changed the original task flow, which was only these two view activities and these two navigation rules, and I've added a wildcard navigation rule called URL launch. Again, going back to our lifecycle listener, you can see URL launch there. And what that allows the application to do now is when the application opens, it allows you to bypass the task flow logic and all the flow and just launch into a particular part of your application. And in this case, it's the employee's details. Remember previously, what our goal here is to do, if another application is launching us, we don't want to force the user to go through the list of employees on the View Employees screen, select an employee and then view their details. That other application already has the employee ID, so we want to leap straight to this screen, and the URL scheme and the URL launch here, the navigation rule will allow us to do that. Okay, so that's the basic changes that we need to make, and we're going to watch what the lifecycle listener import code does in the debugger, and I'll actually explain line by line what we're actually attempting to achieve here. Okay, so here we can see the deployed application, and just remember in JDeveloper we want to start a debug session. So first of all, I'm just going to run the debugger. Okay, you can see the debugger is now listening, and now if we start our Oracle HR application, you can see that it's starting, but in the background you can see that the lifecycle listener import has been called, and we're in the start method and the breakpoint's now waiting for us. So let's explain what's happening at this point. In the lifecycle listener import, the very first thing we need to do beyond registering the URL scheme is in the start method we then need to set up a listener that will listen to external applications calling that URL scheme and then handle whatever they're passing us. So the first time the application starts up, we use the event source factory get event source method to basically say, hey, URL events, so basically other applications that are making use of us or calling us via URL events, hey, we want to do something with that. Okay, then beyond that, what we're going to do is on line 75, we're then going to add an event listener, and below here I've added it as an anonymous class which has methods on message, on error, and on open. But this is the overall class or the handler that will handle a URL event occurring, and then our application needs to respond to that. So at this point, if I just click the execute on button, you'll notice that it's skipped over that breakpoint. And you've got to remember at this point, all I've done is I've started the application and it's registering that URL event handler or the event listener. So there's no other application actually calling our application yet, which will cause the onMessage method of the event listener to be called. So in order to do that, if we return to the iOS simulator, okay, so you can see our application running there in the background, it's doing what it needs to do. But if we return to the launcher application, so here's the launcher application, and there you can see the Go link. Now just as a reminder, the Go link there, if we go back to JDeveloper, we go to the launcher AMX page, you can see the Go link, okay, its URL is calling our registered URL scheme for our Oracle HR app, passing in show employee as the hierarchical part, and then a parameter employee ID equals 3. Okay, so returning to the iOS simulator, let's now touch or click on that, and you can see our application is returned, Oracle HR app, but again, the debugger is now waiting to do something. And because in the previous run we basically have registered that event listener, now what's happening is that the ADF Mobile application is responding to that URL event and saying, okay, well, we have received a message, let's actually do something with that. So what I want to show you at this point is what this actually code does, and the very first thing it does is, well, we grab the event and then we get the payload, which is essentially the URL. So if I step over that line and we look down here at the data window in the debugger, you can actually see the URL coming in, the full URL. Now notice how, and I deliberately set this up, how some of the case is actually changing. So even though in the launcher page we passed in my HR app, and even though the application has my HR app, you can see that the URL is being mangled, whereas some parts are still what you expect. So just watch out for that. You're obviously going to have to code with that. Next, what the application is going to do is pull apart that URL and get the action and get the parameter. Now, as I said earlier on in the presentation, there's no validation of this URL. So if the other application passes in something you don't recognize, or it's a URL full of junk, hey, you're going to have to handle that. And again, you basically just write that code into this spot here. But what I've done is on line 79, I'm going to grab the action, which is basically everything after the double forward slash and to the question mark. So basically I'm going to pull out show employees next. Okay, you can see that. And then my application, it may have multiple different things that it wants to respond to. So do you remember how we said in the presentation that you might, with your overall URL that you passed your application, wanted to define a number of different actions. So I've defined one action called show employee, and that's in fact what's been passed in here. And then once I know that I'm doing the show employee routine, then I'm going to again substring out of the URL the employee ID parameter. So everything after the equals, okay, to the end of the string, which is going to be 3. Okay, so we go 3. Okay, so you can see that being passed in. And then we're going to pass that employee ID up to the application scope.empid. Now, if you remember, back in the employees task flow, in the view employees screen, we were grabbing the ID from the selected row on the list page and passing that up to the application scope empid. And the reason we're doing that was then within the details screen, what we're doing in the bindings is in the set current row with key value method, we were grabbing that empid and we were using it to set the current employee in the employee list. Now that mechanism still exists, right? But if we now come into the employees task flow via the URL launch, because the empid for the application scope hasn't been set by the screen, we're basically bypassing it. That's why back in the lifecycle listener impl, we need to set that empid. Okay, so we needed to give it something so that when it gets to the details page, it has an application scope empid to work with. Anyway, so the point from here is, okay, once we click over that field, I should say that line of code, it passes that up to the dynamic variable empid and application scope, and then finally it calls the employees feature and navigates through the navigation rule that we just saw called URL launch. So let's actually finish that. And if we return to the iOS simulator now, you might remember we were in the list screen previously wherever I had actually left the application, but now we can see that it's automatically skipped to the employee screen here and is showing employee ID 3, Louis Costello. Okay, and so there you go, and that's the basics of setting up a URL scheme, registering the URL scheme, setting up a lifecycle listener impl, okay, to respond to the actual URL event, grabbing the data, the payload, and then navigating to a particular feature and a particular page via the URL launch wildcard that we set up. And there you have it. There's the 5 or so steps that you need to actually write into your ADF mobile applications such that other applications can call you. And vice versa, as we talked about earlier in this presentation, hey, your ADF mobile application can call other applications, not necessarily ADF mobile applications, to invoke them and pass parameters through too. So this really opens you up with a lot of opportunities with your deployed applications to interact with other applications on the device. Just to finalise this presentation today, the Abbott and Costello ADF mobile applications are now available from iTunes and Google Play for $1.99 each. Of course, you might need to buy both of them. They're not very useful without each other. I hope you'll support my secondary income at Oracle Corporation and go and buy these applications right now. Thanks again for your time on this ADF Insider Essentials episode today. Hope this has been useful to you, and we'll catch you in another recording very soon.